Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17, U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use, tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, you guys, this comes from The New Yorker. The Upper West Side cult that hid in plain sight. In the 60s and 70s, the Sullivan Institute had a winning sales pitch for young New Yorkers: parties, sex, low rent, and affordable therapy, by Jessica Winter, June 14, 2023. The Sullivan's housed many of their patient members. Cults thrive in isolation, and this poses a challenge for the urban cult leader Jim Jones of the People's Temple, exerted an unsettling degree of influence on San Francisco politics of the late 1970s, but was eventually forced to flee to his doomed jungle outpost in Guyana. Charles Manson made halting inroads in the late 60s Los Angeles music scene, while his family hunkered down on the 55-acre Spahn movie ranch. Scientology has prominent real estate holdings in major cities across the world, but its elite management unit, the Sea Org, was originally intended to operate in international waters in order to evade government and media scrutiny. At its peak in the mid to late 70s, the Psychoanalytic Association, known as the Sullivan Institute, had as many as 600 patient members, clustered in apartment buildings that the group bought or rented on the cheap on Manhattan's Upper West Side. They also ran an experimental theater troupe called The Fourth Wall on the Lower East Side. The Sullivan's adhered to the same principles and traditions as many of the ashrams in rural intentional communities of the era. Polyamory, communal living, group parenting, social politics. But they came to their belief system through the gateway of psychoanalysis, the self-actualization tool of the urbane intellectual, and they enacted their beliefs on a crowded concrete island of nearly 1.5 million people, often while holding down high-status jobs as physicians, attorneys, computer programmers, and academics. The Institute's co-founder and reigning tyrant, Saul Newton, who sat atop the organization from the mid-1950s until the mid-1980s, he died in 1991, may have come closer than any of his far more notorious peers to establishing a truly metropolitan cult, its members visible, but its practices obscure. The son of Russian Jew who immigrated to Canada, Newton was combative and mercurial, a one-time communist labor organizer who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. He had no medical degree or psychoanalytic training, but one of his wives, Jane Pierce, trained under the renowned American psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan, one of the pioneers of interpersonal analysis. Sullivan, who died in 1949, eschewed the Freudian paradigm of the therapist as a blank screen. The interpersonal analyst might find opportunities to make reciprocal conversation with patients or even offer advice. Newton and Pierce pushed this more interventionist model in an aggressive authoritarian direction when they co-founded the Sullivan Institute in 1957. As Alexander Stowe writes in his juicy, fascinating The Sullivan's Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wildlife of an American Commune, Sullivan therapists became the chief authorities in a patient's life, and their forceful guidance reflected Newton and Pierce's antipathy toward conventions such as monogamy and filial piety. Newton's Times obituary dryly noted, most mental health experts view the Newton Group as having distorted Mr. Sullivan's name and theories. Sound familiar? The Sullivan's bête noire was a nuclear family, which they identified as the wellspring of all human pathology. To shake off bourgeois norms, Sullivan patients lived with same-sex roommates and cultivated close platonic friendships, replete with tween-style sleepovers. They had lots of heterosexual partners. In fact, turning down most any sexual proposition from a group member was frowned upon. That's just like the child of God. Exactly like that. So, I'm just interjecting. Does that mean that they're trying to bypass the R word? That's what it sounds like. Which, I mean, if you don't willingly want it, that would be R. But they were not allowed to form steady romantic relationships. Where have we heard this before? We've heard this before. To a Sullivan, Still explained sexual jealousy was a byproduct of a capitalist mentality that saw marriage and monogamy as a form of ownership. Jackson Pollock, an early Sullivan patient, was a fan of the method in part because he could cheat on his wife. Higher-ups prodded Sullivanans to renounce their parents and other blood relatives. Where have we heard that before? One member ceased contact with her 12-year-old sister because the girl stopped going to therapy. Women had to seek permission to get pregnant. While trying to conceive, they would have sex with multiple men. Jesus. In order to create ambiguity about their child's biological father. That reminds me of the ritual for the moon child. Just look into it. I'm not going to go into that. Ambiguity about the child's biological father. That's very Brave New World, isn't it? Newton, for his part, did not lead by example. Of course he didn't. That's what a narcissist is. Pierce was his fourth wife, and there was no uncertainty about the paternity of Newton's 10 children. Wives number 5 and 6, Joan Harvey and Helen Moses, were also therapists, whom Newton installed as top lieutenants in the Sullivan enterprise. So they're calling them therapists, but they're not really, like, none of them went to school for it, I don't think. The exact appeal of a cult can be impenetrable to outsiders, like suppressive people, and even to its ex-members. But in the 60s and 70s, the Sullivan Institute had a winning sales pitch for young New Yorkers: party, sex, low rent, and affordable therapy. That's the bait. Therapists at the Institute were also willing to write letters to the draft board on behalf of patients who were psychologically unfit to serve in the war in Vietnam, a powerful recruitment tool for the group. Everyone was friends with everyone else. Dozens of young people in a handful of nearby buildings, in and out of one another's apartments, playing music, having parties. Still writes, the novelist Richard Price, who was a creative writing student at Columbia when he became involved in the group in 1972, told Still, it felt to me like this is just add water and it's instant friends. And you know, girls are going in and out, it's instant sex life. Suddenly Price went on, it's like somebody opened the gates of heaven. That's a form of, with all that kind of stuff, that's also a love bombing kind of thing. As in many places mistaken for heaven, the guy at the top mistook himself for God. A true narcissist. Newton's bulldozing megalomania helped to secure the Sullivan Institute's initial success and also ensured its collapse. By the 1980s, Newton and his top therapist had demoniac control over their patients. That's mind control. sex lives, social lives, how they earned or spent money. Much of their income was swallowed up in dues, fines, and assessments. Sound familiar? Ode to the Institute, and how they raised or usually didn't raise their children. The idyllic commune was overrun by snakes and pestilence, financial exploitation, physical and sexual abuse. Where have we heard that? Child neglect and mushrooming paranoia. In Still's view, the Sullivanian Institute encapsulates one of the great themes of the 20th century, the tendency of utopian projects of social liberation to take a totalitarian turn. I believe that was the plan all along. In The Dialectic of Sex from 1970, the radical feminist Shulamith Firestone imagined abolishing the patriarchal nuclear family. Isn't it interesting that all these cults want to destroy the nuclear family? Almost like they're all kind of related or something. Think about that. Oh, shoot. A form of social organization that intensifies the worst effects of inequality inherent in the biological family itself, she wrote. She saw a future in which children could be gestated artificially. Oh, that's Brave New World. Go look it up. They're doing this now. It's really sick. Outside of a human womb and raised communally, like animals. These technological and cultural advancements, Firestone believed would help guarantee greater freedom and autonomy for women and children alike. No, it messes things up. Women would be excused from the reproductive obligations, because you know the Illuminats, they're obsessed with all that stuff, right? Just like L. Ron Hubbard was obsessed with abortion. Reproductive obligations, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, caregiving that subordinated them to men's power. Not really. And children would be spared the Oedipal neurosis that the nuclear family tends to imprint. So that's it, you guys. Let me make sure there's no more. I don't think... Oh, sorry, guys, there's more. Firestone did not romanticize mothers or motherhood. The bond between a woman and her child, she wrote, was a breeding ground for anxiety and neediness. You guys know who's orchestrating all this, right? A mere alliance of the oppressed. The Sullivanians went further. They cast the mother herself as the oppressor. The Conditions of Human Growth, a book co-authored by Newton and Pierce and published in 1963, depicted early motherhood as an unmitigated nightmare. Still writes a kind of death trap from which both parent and child needed to be liberated, in which the child is conditioned to muffle her own needs and desires in order to placate her overwhelmed, soon enraged mother. Under Sullivanian analysis, Jackson Pollock took to referring to his mother as that old womb with a built-in tomb. Wow. The couple's ideas likely had autobiographical underpinnings. Newton's mother, Still writes, was embittered and domineering, while Pierce had suffered bouts of severe postpartum depression. These ideas about mothers and families were also shared by some of the most prominent public intellectuals of the time in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. It's all planned, by the way. In the mid-60s, the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing declared that mothers conflate love with violence and likened the nuclear family both to a gas chamber and to a racketeering ring, one that produced the frightened, cowed, abject creature that we are admonished to be if we are to be normal, offering each other mutual protection from our own violence. The psychologist Bruno Bettelheim, an Austrian-born survivor of Dachau and Buchenwald, compared the mothers of autistic children to Nazi prison guards. Well, there's something funny with all that stuff. The Sullivanian framework mitigated against the dangers posed by the mother by limiting her time with her children, even in their infancy. That's do I want to go there? That's to sever the bond. They do that in satanic cults. They want to sever the bond between the mother and the child. Babysitters did most of the caregiving, and kids not yet old enough to read were packed off to grim boarding schools where physical and sexual abuse were rampant. Two of the more unbearable episodes in the Sylvanians involve the hapless Didia Agee, the daughter of the writer James Agee. In 1974, at the recommendation of her Sylvanian therapist, Agee sent her son Teddy, age 5, to boarding school. When Teddy's father took the miserable boy to come live with him instead, Agee and a few Sylvanian comrades sneaked into his house, snatched the boy, and dumped him back at his dreaded school. After the birth of another son, David, in 1983, Agee was placed under harsh surveillance by her housemates. When the baby did the usual baby things, like cry or spit up, it was held as evidence that Agee was manipulating the child to need her. Wow. This is all inversion, you guys, all of it. Make it seem like the baby or the child wanting nurturing from its mother that is natural, making it seem that it's unnatural. At one point, Newton decreed that Agee could nurse David for only 7 minutes per breast. Agee eventually extracted herself from this perpetual struggle session with some strategic inveigling of Helen Moses, Newton's final wife, and of Newton himself, then 77, who was sufficiently flattered by Agee's supplications that he began having sex with her. We blame everything on mothers, and quite often for good reason. As Carmela Soprano once said to Livia Soprano, "You know the power that you have, and you use it like a pro. You are bigger than life. You are his mother. If something goes wrong with the child, the mother will loom large, either for her presence or for her absence." What the Sylvanian approach neglected to acknowledge, though, was that if you sever a child's ties to their parents, that's the point, you guys. That is the point. An equally destructive parent, Monkey, whether it's Saul Newton or the poorly trained staff at the squalid boarding school. Oh, and you know what happens in boarding schools. Might fill the void. They fuck you up, your mom and dad, but almost anyone will do. The Sylvanians is disjointed and sometimes repetitive, and it probably takes too many liberties in reconstructing word for word hearsay quotations dating back 40 years or more. This is not a sleek or fallacious work, but it scarcely matters when so much of the reporting is this good. The story this pulpy and bizarre, the human behavior on display, so appalling. Like all cult leaders, Newton ignored his own principles when it suited him, while taking others to sadistic extremes, such as the Sylvanian commitment to free love. A lot of cults do that. He demanded blank sex from seemingly every young woman he encountered. Sick. In or out of session, hounding one young patient, Ellen, on a nearly daily basis for almost 20 years, and like all violent patriarchs, or maybe he might be a pedophile, depending on how young those girls were, Newton triggered cycles of abuse across and down generations. Ellen matured into one of the Institute's most awful therapists, at one point urging a teenager who had overslept her alarm to blank herself. When a rank-and-file Sylvanian named Maurice Papo gave birth to her daughter, Jessica, in 1985, and instantly fell under the same constraints and condemnations that Didia Agee had suffered, Agee was one of the loudest voices attacking her. Wow. They're all like, this is all mind control. Their minds are so screwed up. By that point, the Sylvanian Institute was splintering under the weight of defections, custody battles, negative media attention, and investigations into professional misconduct. At least 4 of the group's therapists, so maybe they did have their degrees, I don't know, including Joan Harvey and Helen Moses, lost their licenses. Good. They should have lost more than that. Adult children of the cult began connecting with one another to share the detective work of tracking down biological fathers and siblings, which made for a strange and ironic ending to the story of a group that had set out to dismantle the nuclear family. Still writes, his book demonstrates that in destroying the family, the Sylvanians also replicated its ugliest dynamics. Newton as the tyrannical father, his therapist wives as the enabling mothers, and the lower-ranking patients as their terrified children, scrambling for their unattainable approval. Estrangement is a commonplace in such fractured families. Enforced estrangement from both the blood family and the outside world is a common tool of control in cults. Yeah, they all do it, all of them. The course of the Sylvanian experience was that estrangement was essential to the project and yet impossible. There you were, living in the same apartment as the same person whom you slept with, but weren't allowed to love, the children whom you'd born but couldn't raise. I believe a lot of these cults were orchestrated, and that's all I'm going to say. An earlier version of this article misstated the 1970s era population of Manhattan. Okay, you guys, I will put a link in the description box. Like and subscribe if you choose. Have an amazing day or night wherever you are. Peace.